Storytelling is a very core element of Dungeons & Dragons, and the stories that players and DMs can tell while playing are some of the greatest things that those people will ever experience. Before we peg down what storytelling with D&D is, I do want to talk about what it is not, because I feel like it's easier to isolate storytelling within Dungeons & Dragons if we eliminate some of the fluff and stuff, if you will. So a D&D story is not the campaign or adventure that the players are participating in. That's why no two run-throughs of Lost Mines of Phandelver would ever be exactly the same, because every time you play with new players, a new DM, even if you play with the same group, it might turn out differently because those players have different player characters. The campaign itself is usually just the setting wherein the adventure and the story then takes place. Likewise, the story of Dungeons & Dragons is not the DM's notes of what might happen. Everything the DM prepares for with their notes and deciding the order of events in any given campaign is just set up for the story to take place. In that sense, the DM's notes and the actual campaign and adventure are tied pretty close together, and neither of them are the story itself. A dungeon crawl in Dungeons & Dragons, while a very valid playstyle, is not a storytelling type of game. It chews on game mechanics, and it can be a lot of fun. I've played in a few dungeon crawls myself, and yeah, they're pretty fun, especially if you want a more combat-heavy game. But in my experience, there's been very little, if any, character development, because backstories tend to be irrelevant, and when you're just fighting a monster after monster, there's not really time to have a lot of roleplay, per se, within each session. So dungeon crawling does not set us up to be successful for a narrative and telling a story. While we're talking about dungeon crawling, roll for initiative. If your roll is higher than mine, like the video. If my roll is higher than yours, subscribe. Stories in Dungeons & Dragons are collaborations between the Dungeon Master and the players. This collaboration relies heavily on the player's backstory and what every person involved with that campaign brings to the table. The Dungeon Master has prepared an adventure or campaign and written down some notes in preparation for that campaign, and that gives us a very nice setting and a place for the story to unfold. The players show up with their characters and their backstories. They relay those backstories to the Dungeon Master, who then starts to plug in those backstories into the setup he's already started. Ideally, you'll be in communication with your players long before your first session, so the DM has time to incorporate those backstories and prepare to construct a compelling narrative that makes their characters feel important and give their backstory and character some meaning. The story itself is the narrative that unfolds as the players make choices that change the world of that adventure. Typically, this turns out to be a string of moments spread out across each session that the players will remember forever. As the Dungeon Master, you'll know if you have a very good storytelling moment if you can draw out the emotions of your players. Typically, those emotions are drawn out because the players have found some kind of connection to the game that is meaningful to them. And usually the conduit for that is the characters' backstories. The best stories happen when everybody involved at the table brings something and contributes to that unfolding narrative. So it's really important as a Dungeon Master to encourage your players to engage in roleplay, to make as many decisions as they can while they're playing, and of course you as a Dungeon Master need to always be looking for ways to make sure your players are as connected to the story as possible. Now the vast majority of these stories aren't really going to see the light of day, they're just going to be between you and your players, but that's what makes Dungeons & Dragons so special, is because you can create those stories together as friends and have lasting memories.